In the last 2 years on the YouTube channel, I've ridden over 42 bikes. That is a lot of bikes. And most of the bikes have fallen within the same genre of what is now known as the gravel bike. And in this video, I'm going to talk about what I've learned from that experience. So my first big takeaway from riding all these bikes is that bicycle design is really a game of millimeters and degrees. Half a degree here or a degree there doesn't seem like a whole lot when you're staring at it on a geometry chart, but once that small change gets extrapolated over the length of the bike, it actually makes a noticeable difference to the handling of the bike. So I can definitely tell when a chainstay length has a 5 centimeter difference from a bike I'm riding right next to it. Likewise, in the front, I can generally make a pretty good educated guess on the trail number, whether it's a balanced trail of about 60 or if it's a lower trail in the 30s, or whether it's a relatively high trail bike that's in the 70s and 80s. Sort of the corollary lesson to that, however, is although there are differences in bikes in terms of handling and geometry, you can ultimately adapt. So although you may have preferences for how a bike rides, or if you hop on a bike with a different geometry than you're used to, given about a week of riding, you'll generally be able to adapt to the bike no problem. Another big takeaway is there's no bad bikes in this day and age. I know some of you guys think I pull my punches on bike reviews, but if you think about it, the bike industry is in kind of a tough bind and they can't really afford to make any true lemons. Out of all the bikes I've ridden, there was one with kind of the most serious issues, and that was dropout alignment, but it was on a budget bike. But given how much it costs, it actually wasn't too bad of a bike. I actually think we live in a golden age of the drop bar bike. There are just so many choices. You're not limited to just, thin-tired racy ones. You can get fat-tired mountain bike drop bar bikes if you want, and everything in between. It's truly an amazing time to be a bike nerd. Another big takeaway from riding so many bikes is that although there are many things that can be tweaked within a bike's geometry, from head angle to fork offset to chainstay length to bottom bracket drop, generally all those changes only lead to two outcomes, and they are either making the bike more stable or more responsive. So in the front, if you manipulate the head tube angle and the fork offset and the wheel size and alter the trail number, it can only get more stable or more responsive. The higher the trail, the more stable; the lower the trail, the more responsive. Similarly, in the rear, the longer the chainstay length is, the more stable and planted the bike feels, and the shorter it is, the more responsive and jumpy it feels. So given all the numbers you can manipulate in a bike's geometry, they ultimately lead to just two outcomes. So in some ways, it's actually not as complicated as you would think. Another big takeaway is that bikes can look very similar, but they can handle very differently. The 42 bikes I rode all fell within that kind of general classification of a gravel bike, and if you're unfamiliar with that type of bike, you would assume that they would ride all the same, but far from it. Some were super sporty and jumpy, bikes like the Surly Midnight Special and the Ritchie Outback, and others fell on the slacker, more chill side of the spectrum, like the Gorilla Monsoon or the Bear Claw Bo Jackson. And some bikes really split it down the middle, like the Crust Bambora. So for me personally, that's a point of frustration when people say, well, all the bikes just are the same, when if you actually ride them back to back, they're pretty different. One thing I've also learned is one of the big differences between a budget bike and a more expensive bike, outside of things like weight and components and aesthetics, is that budget bikes tend to have a little bit more of a conservative geometry. They tend to be designed for the masses, whereas more expensive bikes tend to be a little bit more playful, a little bit more experimental in the geometry. And lastly, my biggest takeaway is you don't have to have mystical psychic powers to be able to tell the nuances in a bike. You just have to ride enough bicycles. Being able to tease out how geometry affects handling is a learned skill. So for example, looking at the food world, let's say you get into coffee. When you first start out drinking coffee, all the coffees taste the same. But as you drink more coffees and are just more mindful, then you can really pick out the brighter, fruitier notes in something like an Ethiopian and a Kenyan, and the earthier notes of coffees like Sumatra. But when you first start, it just tastes like coffee. Similarly, in bikes, when you hop on your first handful of bikes, a bike is a bike. But the more bikes you ride, especially if you get to ride them back to back, you can develop a bicycle palate, if you will. And all this riding actually helped inform our bicycle flavor wheel. I wanted a way to kind of objectively talk about bicycles in the same way sommeliers talk about wine and coffee nerds talk about coffee. Basically assigning some sort of adjective to a geometry frame number so we can start talking the same language about bikes. If you want to see all the bikes we've reviewed on this channel, check out these two playlists from our bikes from 2018 and 2019, and look forward to lots of really cool bikes coming in 2020. And as always, keep the supple side down.